The sound of the party was a warm, living thing in my son's beautiful home. Laughter, the gentle thrum of bass from the speakers, the clinking of glasses. It was a symphony of celebration. For Mark, my boy, my only son. I wove through the clusters of well-dressed guests, offering small, genuine smiles, my heart feeling full and heavy at the same time. Full of pride for the man he'd become, heavy with the memory of his mother, who should have been here, her arm linked in mine, sharing this moment. I found my way to the kitchen, a spacious, modern affair of gleaming granite and stainless steel. The noise from the party softened here, muted by a wall and the hum of the stainless steel refrigerator. My glass was empty, the ice long since melted into a faint, watered-down memory of whiskey. I needed a refill, not for the alcohol, but for the prop. A glass in your hand gives you something to do, a reason to stand quietly on the periphery without looking lost. I went through the motions on autopilot, cracked the ice from the dispenser in the fridge door. The clatter was sharp and clean. Pour the amber liquid from the expensive bottle Mark had set out for his guests. The rich, peaty scent of it rose to meet me, a familiar comfort. I was about to turn to paste on my pleasant party guest expression and re-enter the fray, when a voice sliced through the domestic sounds from the other side of the room. It came from behind the pantry door, which was open just a sliver, maybe 2 inches. A sliver wide enough to let sound escape, to let poison leak out. It was Chloe's voice, my future daughter-in-law, the woman who had made my son's face light up in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy. Her tone was different now, stripped of the bright, performative charm she used in the living room. This was lower, conspiratorial, laced with a venomous intimacy. "I know, right?" she scoffed, and the sound was like sandpaper on silk. "This dress is killing me. But that's not even the worst part. I have to smile and nod at that fat pig all night. Ugh, the way he just stands there, hovering. It's so awkward." There was a faint, tinkling giggle of agreement from her friend, her bridesmaid. A sound that validated the cruelty that turned it from a private thought into a shared joke. But Chloe wasn't finished. She had to drive the blade deeper, to twist it. "God," she continued, her voice dripping with a disgust so profound it felt personal. "I can't believe Mark came from that. I mean, look at him. He's just a sad old lonely man." The words did not simply enter my ears. They bypassed that entirely and landed directly in the center of my chest with the force of a physical blow. Fat pig. Sad old lonely man. The air in the kitchen vanished. The laughter from the party became a distant, mocking echo. The only sound that existed was the faint, almost imperceptible clinking of the ice in my glass. My hand had frozen mid-air, the fresh pour of whiskey forgotten. I stared unseeing at the granite countertop, its swirling patterns suddenly looking like a map of chaos. Fat pig. The words hung in the air, cold and deliberate. They weren't a slip of the tongue. They were a verdict. They were the label she had affixed to me in her mind, the summary of my entire being. Alexei Volkov, reduced to a caricature of gluttony and pathetic solitude, and the loneliness. That was the sharpest cut of all. She had looked at my quiet demeanor, my contentment in my own company since my wife passed, and she had seen not strength, not grief weathered, but a fundamental failure, a sadness, a void. For a long suspended moment, I was no longer in my son's kitchen. I was a statue carved from ice. My blood turned to slush. The mask I wore for the world, the gentle, retired, simple father, felt like it was cracking, and for one terrifying, exhilarating second, I felt the old, formidable parts of me stir in the darkness beneath, the parts that built and broke, that calculated and conquered. They shifted like a great beast disturbed from a long slumber. Then, just as quickly, the feeling receded. The world snapped back into focus, the music, the laughter, the hum of the fridge. I slowly lowered my glass to the counter. The ice had stopped clinking. The silence I now held was different. It was no longer the quiet of a contented man. It was the silence before the storm. I took a slow, deliberate breath, my eyes still fixed on that sliver of light from the pantry door. The party was still going on outside this room, but for me, it had just ended. Something else had begun. The ice in my glass made a soft, rhythmic chime as I walked back into the roar of the party. It was the only sound I could focus on, a tiny, controlled metronome against the cacophony of laughter and clinking glasses. My face was a placid mask, carved from years of practice. No one looked twice at me. To them, I was exactly what I appeared to be. Mark's quiet, retired father, the widower who they saw the extra weight around my middle, a comfortable padding they mistook for complacency. They saw my simple, well-worn sweater and my relaxed posture, and they filed me away as harmless, a gentle man, a sad, old, lonely man. The words echoed, but they didn't wound. They were just data. Inaccurate, superficial data. They looked at the container and made grand, foolish assumptions about the contents within. They didn't see the decades of disciplined focus. They didn't see the mind that could calculate compound interest in a heartbeat, that could dissect a balance sheet and find the single thread that, when pulled, would unravel an entire corporate tapestry. My skill was never one of physical prowess. I never built my fortune with my hands. I built it with my mind. It was a different kind of strength, one that operated in the silent, sterile world of numbers, contracts, and strategic leverage. It was the acumen to see value where others saw rubble, and the ruthlessness to acquire it without sentiment. I found my previous spot near the bookshelf, a half-shadowed alcove that offered a perfect vantage point. I took a slow sip of my drink, the cold liquid, a familiar anchor. My eyes swept the room, no longer just seeing a celebration, but assessing an ecosystem. There was Chloe, the center of a buzzing hive of her friends, her laughter like shattering glass. She cast a glance my way, a quick dismissive flick of her eyes, and then turned back, secure in her judgment. She saw a fat pig. I saw an asset that had dramatically depreciated in value and was now a liability to my son's future happiness. And there was her father, Robert Vance, holding court by the fireplace. He was a man who wore his success like a cheap, loud suit. I watched him gesticulate, telling some story about a business triumph, his voice carrying a tone of bombastic certainty. He saw me, too. He gave me a small, tight, patronizing smile, the kind you offer to a simpleton or a pet. He saw a man who was no longer in the game, a relic from a bygone era who posed no threat, offered no value. He mistook my silence for emptiness. But my silence was never empty. It was full. It was a reservoir of patience, of observation, of calculated restraint. In the cutthroat world of high finance, where I had made my name, the loudest man in the room was usually the most desperate, the one trying to sell a narrative to cover a weakness. True power didn't need to announce itself. It was quiet, patient, and absolute. It was the power of the majority shareholder who never attended board meetings, the silent partner whose name on a document could shift markets. I was a dormant king, and these people, in their glittering ignorance, were my pawns. They moved across the board according to their simple, predictable desires. For status, for approval, for a feeling of superiority. They had no idea the board itself belonged to me. Chloe's insult wasn't a personal attack. It was a symptom of a profound lack of character, a flaw in the foundation of the life my son was about to build. And Robert's condescension was the arrogance of a man standing on a platform he didn't realize I was holding up. So I stood there in my calm before. The storm wasn't one of rage or shouted accusations. That was their language, the language of pawns. My storm would be different. It would be silent, surgical, and administrative. It would happen in boardrooms they weren't invited to, through phone calls they would never hear, by leveraging the invisible architecture of ownership I had spent a lifetime building. I took another slow sip, the ice settling in my glass. Let them have their party. Let them enjoy their illusions. The audit was coming. The party ended, but the chill from the pantry doorway never really left me. It settled deep in my bones, a quiet, constant hum beneath the surface of my days. At first I told myself it was a one-off, a moment of cruel gossip from a young woman who didn't know any better. I gave her the grace my late wife would have wanted me to extend. But grace, I soon learned, was a currency they had no intention of reciprocating. The shift was subtle at first, a change in the atmospheric pressure of our family gatherings. It began with Chloe's concern. We were all at Mark's apartment for a Sunday dinner, a tradition I cherished. The table was laden with food. My son may have fallen for a sharp-tongued woman, but he still knew how to host a proper meal. As I reached for a second helping of the roasted potatoes, her voice cut through the conversation, sweet as poison. "You know, Alexei," Chloe said, her smile a perfect practice curve. "I was reading this fascinating article about heart health in men your age." She paused, ensuring she had the table's attention. Mark looked up, curious. It suggested that complex carbohydrates, like those potatoes, can be so hard on the system. Maybe you should try the steamed greens instead. We just want you around for a while. Long, long time. The words were draped in the velvet cloak of care, but the intent was a naked blade. For my health. My hand, holding the serving spoon, didn't falter. I simply looked at her, at the earnest mask she wore for my son's benefit, and I gave a small, non-committal nod. I took the potatoes anyway. The message was received, but it would not command me. Yet in that moment I saw the strategy. It wasn't just an insult anymore. It was a campaign to reframe me in my own son's eyes, not as his father, but as a problem to be managed, a burden to be coddled. This personal critique soon found its corporate counterpart. The wedding planning, which I had looked forward to with a quiet, sentimental joy, became a stage for my gradual erasure. Invitations to cake tastings and venue tours simply stopped coming. When I asked Mark about it, he looked uncomfortable, shuffling his feet. "It's just, Chloe and her dad are handling most of the details, Pop," he said, avoiding my eyes. "They're calling it a more modern, sophisticated affair. You know how these things are." I did know. I knew exactly how these things were. Modern and sophisticated was the polite code for no old-world relics allowed. It was a deliberate exclusion, a way to strip me of my role, my place. I was being edited out of the narrative of my own son's life, reduced to a passive guest who would simply show up on the day. The alliance between Chloe's personal barbs and her father's professional arrogance was formally cemented at a family dinner at the Vances' opulent, soulless home. Robert Vance held court at the head of a table that was too large for the room, a man who believed his own press releases. He was what the business pages called self-made, a term I've always found amusing. No one is truly self-made. They simply forget the shoulders they stood on. The conversation turned, as it always did with Robert, to his company, Vance Innovations. He launched into a monologue about its explosive growth, his voice booming with a pride that bordered on aggression. He spoke of market disruption and paradigm shifts, his eyes scanning the table, lingering on me with a look of pure, unadulterated condescension. "Of course, Alexei," he said, leaning back in his chair, as if bestowing a great wisdom upon me. "It's a different world from the one you and I grew up in. All this technology, the global markets, it must be hard to keep up. It's a young person's game now." He smiled, a bland, patronizing thing, and took a sip of his expensive wine. He saw a retired, widowed man with a fondness for simple food and quiet evenings. He saw the extra weight around my middle and mistook it for a lack of discipline. He saw my gentle demeanor with my son and mistook it for a soft mind. He saw a relic. What he did not see was the man who had spent 3 decades not just playing the game, but quietly, patiently redesigning the board itself. He didn't see the mind that could calculate compound interest and human avarice with equal precision. He saw a pawn, and in his arrogance, he never thought to check if the pawn was, in fact, the king. I didn't argue. I didn't try to correct him. I simply listened, my face a placid lake, while beneath the surface, the tectonic plates of my patience were grinding against each other. I watched him, and I watched his daughter, a perfect mirror of his own smug sense of superiority. In that moment, the 2 threads of their disrespect, the personal and the professional, wove together into a single, unbreakable cord. The insult was no longer a solitary event. It was a system, and I have always been exceptionally good at dismantling flawed systems. The clinking of silverware on crystal was a sound I had always found vaguely irritating. It was the sound of privilege announcing itself, a prelude to self-congratulation. Tonight, in the opulent, overlit ballroom of a hotel I could have bought with the loose change in one of my investment portfolios, the sound was particularly sharp. It was the wedding rehearsal dinner, and Robert Vance, Chloe's father, was tapping his glass, a wide, practiced smile plastered on his face. The room fell into a polite hush. I was seated at a table near the back, a placement I was sure was no accident. From here, I had a perfect panoramic view of the performance. Mark, my son, sat at the head table, his hand resting on Chloe's. He looked happy, hopeful. A part of me, the father, ached for that hope to be real. The other part of me, the strategist, saw the fragile architecture of the entire situation and knew it was built on sand. "Friends, family," Robert began, his voice a smooth, confident baritone that carried effortlessly. "What a joy it is to see 2 such wonderful young people about to embark on the greatest journey of their lives." He spoke about love, about destiny, the usual platitudes. I sipped my water, my face a mask of placid attentiveness. Inside I was a vault, sealed and silent. Then his tone shifted. It became sharper, more pointed. "And I have to say," he continued, his gaze sweeping the room before landing, for just a fraction of a second too long, on me. "I am so proud of my Chloe, for her discernment, for her elevated standards. In a world full of mediocrity, she has always had the clarity to choose quality, to reach for the best." The words were a velvet-wrapped brick. Elevated standards. Discernment. They were the same words Chloe had used to justify her subtle cruelties, her comments about my diet, my clothes, my quiet existence. He was codifying her insults into a family virtue, and he was doing it in front of everyone. A cold needle of anger pricked at the edges of my control, but I did not flinch. I simply watched him, as a geologist might watch a seismograph, noting the tremors. He then seamlessly pivoted, as men like him often do, from personal praise to professional boasting. The wedding, it seemed, was merely a convenient backdrop for his own triumph. "And you know," he said, puffing out his chest slightly, "it seems to be a season of incredible blessings for our family. I am thrilled to announce, tonight, that Vance Innovations has just secured a landmark deal, a partnership that will, without a doubt, make us a household name. This is the culmination of years of my vision, my relentless drive." He went on, detailing the supposed genius of his strategy, the brilliance of his negotiation. He painted a picture of himself as a titan of industry, a self-made king surveying his new domain. The guests murmured appreciatively, impressed by the sheer force of his self-regard. I simply listened, cataloguing each exaggeration, each lie of omission, and then he said it. Of course, he waved a dismissive hand as if shooing away a fly. We have our silent partners to thank. The investors. AV Holdings, our majority stakeholder, provided the capital. They got lucky, betting on my horse, I suppose. He chuckled, and a ripple of sycophantic laughter echoed through the room. He said the name as a footnote, a trivial detail in the grand epic of Robert Vance. AV Holdings. The air in the room didn't change, but the air inside my head did. It was as if a single perfectly cut key had been inserted into a lock deep within my mind and turned. Click. The sound was not loud, but it was absolute. It was the sound of every puzzle piece snapping into place. The hypocrisy, the staggering ingratitude, the sheer blind arrogance of it all crystallized in that single silent moment. AV Holdings, my company, the entity I had created decades ago, a ghost ship I captained from the shadows. It was the vessel through which I anonymously owned 51% of the business he was standing there claiming to have built through his own genius. The capital he so dismissively credited was my life's work, the product of 1,000 calculated risks he would never have had the nerve to take. The stability that allowed him to posture and preen was the foundation I had poured, stone by stone, while he was still learning to tie his tie. He saw a lucky investor. I saw the truth. He was a tenant in a house whose deed he had never even seen, bragging to the neighbors about his exquisite architecture. I didn't move. I didn't glare. I simply looked at him, and for the first time that evening, I truly saw him. Not as my son's future father-in-law, not as a pompous businessman, but as an asset, a mismanaged, over-leveraged and deeply flawed asset. And I am, at my core, an asset manager. The sleeping lion didn't roar. It didn't need to. It simply opened one eye, and in the deep, ancient stillness of that single gaze, it saw everything. It saw the path forward, the audit clauses, the client list, the shareholder agreements. The plan, cold, clean, and utterly merciless, began to assemble itself in the quiet theater of my mind. The performance was over. The audit was about to begin. The door to my study clicked shut, and the world outside ceased to exist. The faint, tinny echo of Robert Vance's voice, the smug satisfaction in his toast, the collective approving murmur of the guests. It all faded into a distant hum, a nuisance I could now tune out. I didn't slam my fist on the desk. I didn't pour a drink. I simply stood in the center of the room, the plush Persian rug soft beneath my feet, and let the silence envelop me. Rage is a fire, it's hot, it's loud, and it burns everything it touches, including the one who wields it. What stirred in me now was the opposite. It was the deep glacial cold of absolute focus. I didn't feel anger. I felt a switch being flipped, a system rebooting after a long, voluntary dormancy. The part of me I had carefully packed away after my wife passed, the part I thought I'd retired for good, was stirring from its slumber. It wasn't a monster. It was an architect, and it was looking at a structure that had become unsound. My eyes drifted closed, and I was no longer in my quiet study. I was in a different room 30 years ago, with a different rug, threadbare and stained with coffee. The air smelled of stale cigarette smoke and desperation. A phone, heavy and beige, was pressed to my ear. I was making my 100th cold call of the day, my voice steady, my proposition sharp, cutting through the noise of 100 other dreamers. That was the beginning, not with a grand inheritance or a lucky break, but with a relentless, grinding pressure applied to the weak points of the market. I learned then that the world isn't built by the loudest voices, but by the most patient minds. I learned to see the leverage points, the tiny fractures in a company's foundation that, if pressed just right, would cause the entire edifice to shift. Leveraged buyouts. They sound so clinical, so sterile. but they were a form of high-stakes poetry. You find a business, a good business, burdened by the wrong kind of debt, managed by people who had lost the vision. You use its own assets as collateral to borrow the money to buy it, a beautiful, dangerous paradox. Then you step in. You don't shout, you don't fire everyone in a blaze of glory. You perform surgery. You cut away the sentiment, the dead weight, the inefficient loyalties. You streamline, you refocus, you make it lean and hungry again. And then, once it's purring like a well-tuned engine, you either sell it for a fortune or you keep it, a silent cash-flowing jewel in your crown. That was my real skill. It wasn't just having capital, it was knowing where to place it, and more importantly, when to pull it back. I was a strategist. I could build an empire with a series of quiet, calculated phone calls, and I could reduce another to rubble with the same tool. My mind was the weapon, my silence was the sheath. And Robert Vance, he was never the architect. He was the foreman, a competent one, I'll grant him that. He had energy, a certain charisma that worked well in middle management. When I first identified his little tech startup, it was a promising idea drowning in chaos. He had the pieces, but he had no idea how to assemble them into something that could last. I provided the capital, the strategic roadmaps, the introductions to the right people, the people whose names he dropped tonight as if they were his own personal contacts. I let him put his name on the door. I let him take the credit at industry galas. It was easier that way. It kept the spotlight off me, the silent partner. A V Holdings, Alexei Volkov. He built the facade. I poured the foundation and raised the load-bearing walls. And tonight, at his daughter's rehearsal dinner, he had stood there, preening, and insulted the very man who owned the ground he was standing on. He mistook my quiet contentment for simple-mindedness. He saw my grief-forged solitude as loneliness. He saw the body of a man who enjoys his food and missed the mind of the man who provided it. A plan began to form in my mind, not as a burst of inspiration, but as a series of interlocking components clicking smoothly into place. This wasn't about vengeance. Vengeance is emotional, messy. This was about reclamation. It was about realignment. Robert Vance had forgotten his place in the ecosystem I had created. He had allowed his daughter to treat me with contempt, and he had personally condescended to me, all while his success, his very identity, was a carefully managed project of mine. It was time for a performance review. It was time to audit my asset. I opened my eyes and walked to my desk, the solid mahogany cool under my fingertips. I didn't need to rush. I didn't need to shout. The machinery of my past life was still there, well-oiled and waiting. All it needed was a single command from its master. The ghost from my past wasn't a specter of regret, it was a blueprint for action, and the construction was about to begin. The click of my study door was the sound of a world shifting. Outside, the echoes of Robert Vance's smug toast still hung in the air of my own home, but in here, there was only the quiet hum of purpose. For 30 years I had practiced a discipline most men never understand, the art of stillness. They mistake it for idleness, but stillness is not empty. It is a reservoir, and mine was full to the brim. My first call was not made in anger. It was made with the cool, detached tone of a surgeon confirming an operation. My lawyer, Arthur Shaw, has been with me for 25 years. He has seen me build fortunes and dismantle rivals. He knows the sound of my voice when the game is on. Arthur Alexei Volkov, we are initiating Article 7, Section B of the AV Holdings Agreement with Vance Innovations, a full unannounced financial audit, effective immediately. There was a pause on the other end, not of hesitation, but of processing. The wedding is tomorrow, Alexei. Precisely. I said, my voice flat. I want the notification to hit their legal department first thing in the morning. Let Robert read it with his coffee and croissant while he's putting on his tuxedo. I pictured it. The phone buzzing, the confused frown, the dawning horror as he reads the legalese that gives me, as the majority silent partner, the right to dissect his entire financial life with no warning. It was a clause he had lightly glossed over, a formality in the mountain of paperwork that came with my money. He was about to learn that I do not include clauses for decoration. Next was Simon Prentice, the head of AV Holdings. My voice, my proxy. Simon, the Vance audit is a go. I want our best team on it. I want every invoice, every expense report, every offshore account scrutinized. Look for anything. Personal expenses billed to the company, favorable deals with shell corporations, inflated valuations on his landmark deal. I knew Robert. A man that arrogant, that condescending, always has corners he's cut. He always has secrets he thinks are his alone. We were about to hold them up to the light. The second part of the countermove was more delicate. It was about severing the limbs, not just wounding the body. Robert's landmark deal, the one he'd bragged about as his crowning achievement, rested on 3 clients: Global Synergies, Techmar Solutions, and Bryson Industries. He saw them as his conquests. He was wrong. They were my relationships. I opened a small leather-bound address book, a relic from a time before cloud storage, filled with handwritten numbers and private lines. My first call was to James Bryson, the Patriarch of Bryson Industries. James, Alexei Volkov. Alexei, my God, it's been years. To what do I owe the pleasure? His voice was warm, familiar. We had done business when his company was on the brink, and my capital and counsel had saved it. It's about the deal with Vance Innovations, I said, my tone conversational, almost weary. There's an internal review underway. Some irregularities we need to clear up. As a courtesy, I'm advising you to place a temporary hold on all activities. A week, perhaps 2, just until we can ensure everything is structurally sound. I didn't need to say more. James Bryson was a man who understood the language of power. An internal review, he repeated, the warmth leaving his voice, replaced by the cool tone of a businessman assessing risk. Initiated by you. By AV Holdings, I confirmed, letting the name hang between us. He knew what it meant. He knew who I was. Consider it done, Alexei, and thank you for the heads up. The calls to the CEOs of Global Synergies and Techmar were identical in their execution and result. There were no questions, no arguments. They heard the name AV Holdings. They heard my calm, authoritative tone, and they complied. In less than an hour, the 3 pillars of Robert's triumphant deal were frozen solid. The news would trickle back to him slowly, then all at once. The contracts weren't cancelled, they were in stasis, and that was far more terrifying. It was a limbo from which they might never return. The final move was the most personal and therefore the most dangerous. I found my son, Mark, in the living room staring out at the dark garden. He looked young and in that moment painfully naive. "We need to talk," I said, my voice softer now, but no less firm. He turned, his face a mask of pre-wedding stress. "What is it, Dad?" "If this is about the seating chart?" "It's about the woman you are marrying," I interrupted, holding his gaze. "I have remained silent out of respect for you. But my silence ends now. I have watched her, Mark. I have listened, the comments about my weight, my life, my solitude, the way she and her father speak of me when they think I cannot hear. That is not stress. That is not pre-wedding nerves. That is her character." He started to protest, a defensive fire in his eyes. "Chloe loves me, Dad. She's just under a lot of pressure." A person's true nature is not revealed in comfort, Mark. It is revealed under pressure. And what I have seen is a profound lack of respect, not just for me, but for the man I raised. You are a better man than to be a prop in someone else's shallow fantasy of success. I am telling you this not as a father demanding obedience, but as a man who has spent a lifetime reading people. Look at her. Truly look at her. See the woman who is standing beside you, not the one you hope is there. I saw the conflict in his eyes, the love he felt warring with the dawning ugly truth. I had planted the seed. I could not force it to grow. That was his journey. But I had watered it with a cold, hard truth. I left him there in the quiet of the room and returned to my study. The calls had been made. The machinery was in motion. From the outside, the world was the same. The wedding venue was being prepared. The flowers were being arranged. But the structure of Robert Vance's world, the foundation of his arrogance and his daughter's cruelty, was already crumbling. It was happening silently, invisibly, from the inside out. And I, the quiet, overlooked man, was the architect of its collapse. I sat in my leather chair, the stillness settling around me once more. The game was not over. It had only just begun. The string quartet was playing something light and classical, the kind of music that's meant to be the background to clinking glasses and polite laughter. The wedding reception was in full swing, a spectacle of white lilies and champagne flutes, a perfect stage for Robert Vance's continued performance. I stood near the back, a silent guest in a room full of people who still saw me as scenery. I watched him work the room, his arm around his daughter, Chloe, their smiles looking painted on, a little too bright, a little too brittle. I'd seen that look before in businessmen whose empires were teetering on the edge of a cliff they hadn't yet spotted. I didn't have to wait long. He broke away from a conversation, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on me. The confident stride he'd used all evening was gone, replaced by a stiff, hurried walk. He looked like a man who had just been told his parachute was only for decoration. He clutched his phone in his hand so tightly I thought the screen might crack. "Alexei," he said, his voice a strained whisper, pulling me by the elbow into a relatively quiet corner near a towering floral arrangement. The scent of the flowers was cloying, sweet and suffocating. "We need to talk." Now I didn't resist. I simply turned to face him, my hands resting calmly at my sides. The mask of the gentle, retired father was still in place, but behind my eyes, the real me was wide awake and watching. "The audit," he hissed, holding up his phone as if it were a piece of damning evidence. "It's a full forensic. They've frozen the operational accounts. And the clients, Henderson, Greystone, all of them, they've all put the new deal on an indefinite hold. They cited instability at the leadership level. What is happening? Who is doing this?" His face was the color of old parchment. A fine sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead, catching the light from the crystal chandeliers above. The panic in his voice was a live wire, sparking and dangerous. This was a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of control, and that illusion was disintegrating second by second. I let the silence hang between us for a moment, letting him feel the full weight of his own helplessness. The music swelled slightly, a cruel, cheerful counterpoint to his unraveling. I looked at him, my gaze flat and calm, the way one might look at a complicated equation that has just been solved. "You built your house on my foundation, Robert," I said, my voice low and even, barely louder than the rustle of the nearby guests. It wasn't an accusation, it was a simple statement of fact, delivered with the finality of a judge's gavel. He blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" "My foundation. I built Vance Innovations from the ground up." "You enjoyed the view," I continued, as if he hadn't spoken, "but you forgot who owned the land." I saw the gears turning in his head, the frantic search for meaning. He was still looking for a competitor, a rival, a corporate raider. He wasn't looking at the man standing right in front of him. So I gave him the final piece, the key that would unlock the prison he had built for himself. AV Holdings. I paused, letting the letters hang in the air. I could see the recognition start to dawn, a flicker of terrified understanding in his eyes. Alexei Volkov. The effect was instantaneous and profound. It was as if I had reached inside his chest and physically pulled the plug on his vitality. The blood drained from his face so completely, so rapidly, that for a second I thought he might simply faint. His jaw went slack. His eyes, wide with panic just a moment before, now widened further with a horror so deep it was almost religious. The legendary reclusive investor. The name on the confidential board reports he received quarterly. The silent majority partner whose approval he needed for any major expenditure. The ghost who funded his life, his daughter's wedding, his very sense of self. The fat pig, the sad, old, lonely man, the uneducated relic. The pieces crashed together in his mind. I could see the collision happening behind his eyes, the insults his daughter had casually thrown, his own condescending speeches, the way they had both looked right through me. They hadn't just been mocking a quiet old man. They had been spitting in the face of the architect of their entire world. A strangled, guttural sound escaped his lips. It wasn't a word. It was the sound of a man's entire reality breaking. He stumbled back, as if I had struck him, his legs buckling. His hand shot out, gripping the edge of a nearby linen-draped table for support. The table shuddered, and a champagne flute wobbled, tipped and fell, shattering on the floor with a sharp, clear ring that cut through the music and the murmur of the party. For a moment, there was silence in our immediate vicinity. All he could do was stare at me, his body trembling, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The illusion of Robert Vance, the self-made titan of industry, shattered into a million irretrievable pieces right there on the polished ballroom floor, and all that was left was a terrified, foolish man who had finally met his landlord. The silence that followed my quiet statement to Robert was more deafening than any music or laughter the string quartet had managed all evening. It was a vacuum sucking the air from the room, and into that void rushed the sound of his world breaking. His face, which had been a mask of panicked confusion, crumpled. It wasn't just an expression of shock, it was a structural failure. The arrogance that had propped up his features for decades simply gave way, and what was left was the pale, trembling visage of a man who had just realized he'd been living in a house of cards, and the architect had just blown the door open. He made a small, choked sound, a wet gurgle deep in his throat, and his hand flew to his mouth. He didn't even make it to a trash can. He simply doubled over, right there on the polished parquet floor, and was violently, publicly sick. The sound of it, the sheer physicality of his humiliation, was the starting pistol. The spell was broken. And then Chloe's voice cut through the stunned quiet, a shriek of pure, undiluted terror. It wasn't the fear of a lost wedding, but the terror of a plummeting socialite who has just seen the elevator cable snap. "Daddy!" she screamed, rushing to his side, but her eyes weren't on him. They were darting around the room, at the horrified faces of the guests, at the waiters, trying not to stare, and finally, they landed on me. The understanding dawned in them, slow and ugly. The fat pig, the sad, old, lonely man. Her future, her status, her entire imagined life of luxury. It was all alone from the very man she had scorned. The foundation of her identity was sand, and the tide was coming in. "You," she spat at me, her voice trembling with a venomous mix of rage and panic. "You did this. You ruined everything." But the most important transformation was happening just a few feet away. My son, Mark. I watched him. He had been frozen, a statue holding a champagne flute, his gaze darting between his vomiting future father-in-law and his shrieking fiancée. He looked at Chloe, truly looked at her, perhaps for the first time. He saw the hysterical mask of her face, not the beautiful, composed one she always wore for him. He saw the raw, ugly entitlement, the complete lack of compassion for her own father in his moment of utter degradation. He saw the woman who had whispered insults about his own father, and he finally connected those whispers to this screaming, desperate person before him. His eyes, wide with dawning horror, then found mine. There was no anger there, not yet. There was a profound, heartbreaking confusion, a plea for an explanation that made sense of this nightmare. In that look, I saw the little boy who used to believe his father could fix anything, and the man who was realizing that his father had fixed something in the most brutal way imaginable. I held his gaze, my own expression neutral, a placid lake after a storm has passed. I offered no apology, no justification, just the simple, unshakable truth of my presence. That was all it took. The scales fell from his eyes. The illusions he'd built around Chloe, around her family, around the life he thought he was stepping into, they shattered into a million pieces at his feet. He didn't shout. He didn't throw his glass. He simply set it down on a nearby table with a quiet final click. His voice, when it came, was low and firm, cutting through Chloe's sobs. "It's over." The two words hung in the air, more powerful than any of Robert's boasts or Chloe's screams. "What?" Chloe gasped, whirling on him, her face a mess of tears and smeared makeup. "The wedding," Mark said, his voice gaining strength as he looked at her, his gaze now clear and cold. "It's off, and all of it. It's over." The room, which had been a simmering pot of whispers, now boiled over, a spectacle of fallen pride, just as I knew it would be. The Vance family, the picture of modern sophistication just minutes ago, was now a public display of illness, hysteria, and broken engagements. Guests murmured behind their hands, some looking scandalized, others with a grim, knowing satisfaction. I saw it all from my calm center. This was not my chaos. I had not created it. I had merely stopped propping up the facade, and gravity had done the rest. I didn't look at Robert again, still kneeling in his own shame. I didn't acknowledge Chloe's continued wails. My work here was done. I caught my son's eye one last time. He was standing tall amidst the wreckage, a man making his first truly difficult, independent decision. I gave him a single, slow nod. It wasn't a nod of, "I told you so." It was a nod of recognition, a silent transmission of support that said, "I see you. I am here. You are doing the right thing." And then I turned. I didn't make a speech. I didn't offer a parting shot. I simply walked. I walked past the gaping guests, past the frozen waitstaff, through the ornate doors of the banquet hall, and out into the cool, quiet night. The sounds of the collapse faded behind me with each step. I left them to it, to the ruins of their own making. They had built their kingdom on my silence, and they had forgotten that silence too has a voice. And tonight it had spoken its final word. The old leather of my favorite armchair groans softly as I settle into it, a sound as familiar and comforting as my own breathing. From the large bay window I watched the afternoon sun paint the backyard in hues of gold and amber. It's a peaceful scene, one that, months ago, felt like a cage of quiet disrespect. Now it feels like a kingdom I've rightfully reclaimed, not through force, but through the simple, unassailable truth of who I am. The restructuring of Vance Innovations was a quiet, surgical affair. The new management team I installed, sharp, hungry, and fiercely loyal to the bottom line, not to a name, reports to me weekly. The company is more profitable than ever. It's a strange sort of poetry, I suppose. Robert Vance built his identity on that company's facade, and I, the man he dismissed as a fat pig, was the one who ensured its survival and success long after his own hubris had been scrubbed from its halls. He's living in a condo in Florida now, I'm told. I don't wish him ill. In a way, I did him a favor. He no longer has to carry the weight of a kingdom he never truly built. The quarterly dividends that still find their way to his account are more a courtesy from my sense of order than any sense of obligation. The asset has been optimized, but the real profit, the true wealth of this entire endeavor, wasn't measured on any balance sheet. It sits across from me now on my worn-out sofa, laughing at something on his phone. My son, Mark. The change in him is profound. The fog of infatuation has lifted, replaced by a clear-eyed maturity that makes my chest swell with a pride I haven't felt in years. He's dating a woman named Sarah, a librarian with a laugh that sounds like wind chimes and eyes that hold no calculation. She doesn't see my quietness as emptiness or my size as a subject for mockery. Last week she brought me a biography of a financier I'd actually done business with decades ago. She'd remembered an offhand comment I'd made. The gesture was so simple, so genuine, it nearly undid me. Mark and I talk now, truly talk. We've started a new ritual, fishing on Saturday mornings, out on the still lake with nothing but the sound of water lapping against the boat. The silence between us is no longer awkward. It's companionable. He's asked me questions, not about the money, but about the mindset. How did I stay so calm? How did I know when to move? I've shared pieces of my past with him, stories of building fortunes from rubble, of reading the subtle tells in a market or a man's eyes. He listens, really listens, and I see him understanding for the first time that the strength he witnessed at the wedding wasn't an anomaly. It was the culmination of a lifetime of discipline. He sees the foundation now, not just the quiet house sitting atop it. The family dynamic has shifted on its axis. I am still the same man in appearance. I still enjoy my food. I still wear my simple, comfortable clothes. But the filter through which my family sees me has been permanently altered. I am no longer the kindly, slightly pathetic grandfather figure to be patted on the head and politely ignored. I am the patriarch. The respect is unspoken but palpable. It's in the way my daughter-in-law seeks my opinion on a major purchase, in the way my grandchildren now come to me with their more serious questions, instinctively understanding that the man in the quiet chair might just have the answers they need. So that's the peace I feel now is deep and resonant. It is not the peace of surrender or isolation. It is the peace of a man who no longer has to prove anything to anyone. The world has been gently, firmly reminded of the foundation upon which it stands. My silence is no longer mistaken for weakness. It is recognized for what it has always been, a choice. And in this chosen silence, surrounded by the genuine respect of my family and the quiet hum of a well-ordered world, I have found a victory far sweeter than any boardroom conquest. This is the legacy that matters. This is the profit that truly endures. Let me tell you something I learned over many long years, in boardrooms and in back alleys, in times of great fortune and in moments of profound loss. It is a lesson that was carved into my bones long before Chloe's careless words or Robert's arrogant sneers. It is this: never ever mistake a man's silence for weakness or his kindness for foolishness. People are so quick to judge the book by its cover. They see a quiet man, a man who enjoys his food, a man who doesn't feel the need to shout his accomplishments from the rooftops, and they write a story for him. They write a story of simplicity, of emptiness. They see the gentle demeanor and assume there is no steel beneath it. They hear the calm voice and assume there is no thunder waiting to be unleashed. This is the most dangerous assumption a person can make. In this world, we are taught to respect the noise, the man pounding the table, the one boasting of his latest deal, the one who fills every silence with the sound of his own voice. We are conditioned to see that as power. But I am here to tell you that is a lie. The loudest man in the room is very often the most insecure. He is making noise to convince himself, first and foremost. True strength, genuine, unshakable power, it is quiet. It is patient, and above all, it is strategic. It does not need to announce itself. It does not need to seek validation from every passerby. It is the deep root system of an ancient tree, unseen beneath the soil, while the noisy, colorful flowers bloom and wilt with every passing season. It observes, it calculates, it understands that time is not an enemy but an ally. It waits for the right moment, the precise alignment of circumstances to act. And when it does act, it is not with rage or bluster, but with the quiet, inevitable force of a tectonic plate shifting. It is the correction of a fundamental imbalance. What happened with Robert and Chloe was not an act of vengeance. Let me be clear on that. Vengeance is a hot, messy, emotional thing. What I did was a reclamation. It was a simple, cold, logical realignment of reality with the truth. Their world, their status, their very sense of self was built upon a foundation they neither acknowledged nor respected. They enjoyed the view from the penthouse, but never once wondered who truly owned the land the building stood on. They never asked who held the deed, and that is the final, most crucial part of this lesson. In every relationship, in every business, in every family dynamic, there is a foundation. There is someone or something that provides the stability, the capital, the quiet support that allows everything else to function. It is the parent who sacrificed, the partner who believed, the silent investor who provided the means. Never forget who holds those deeds to your kingdom, and never ever insult the hand that built the walls that shelter you, because that strength, that quiet, patient, strategic strength, does not forget. It does not hold a grudge. That would be a waste of energy. It simply remembers the balance sheet, and when the time comes to settle accounts, it does so not with anger, but with the calm finality of a judge delivering a verdict that was written the moment the first insult was casually uttered. So look at the quiet people in your life. Look at the ones who smile and nod, who don't fight for the spotlight. Look at the ones you might, in a moment of arrogance, dismiss. And ask yourself, what is the true source of their peace? Is it emptiness? Or is it the profound confidence that comes from knowing with absolute certainty exactly what you are capable of, and knowing you do not need to prove it to anyone until the moment it truly matters? That is the lesson. A silent man is not a weak man. A kind man is not a fool. The real power in this world doesn't make a sound until it is ready to change everything. Remember that. And if you know someone in your own life who needs a reminder of who truly holds the deeds, who needs to understand the weight of a quiet strength, then share this story with them. It might just save them from a collapse of their own making.